Hello. In this video, I'd like to discuss the question of the kinds of repression you might anticipate in a democratic society. We should start by noting the obvious point that the kinds of repression you might face in democratic countries might be different from the kinds of repression that there are in authoritarian settings. Overall, I'd like to discuss two larger points when thinking about repression. The first is to think about the different types of repression you might face. A social movement scholar by the name of Ruth Koopmans made an important distinction between institutional repression and situational repression. The easiest way of thinking about the difference between the two is to imagine institutional repression as more general repressive measures that limit activists' ability to mobilize. You can find these repressive measures in laws or other broad sets of rules that are widely applicable. Situational repression, on the other hand, are, quote, on-the-ground responses to forms of mobilizing, such as public protests. Because these are responses to specific acts of mobilization, the kinds of situational repression you might see will depend on the kinds of mobilization they are responding to. An example might further clarify the difference between the two. Imagine that you want to organize a large march for a cause that you believe in. In many democratic societies, including the United States, you will often have to apply for a permit to protest, which is usually issued by a local government. When applying for that permit, officials will decide whether your march or event may violate established laws surrounding large public gatherings. The law against disturbing the peace is one such law that may be relevant. Although the law against disturbing the peace is intended to protect communities from unruly public behavior, it has also been used in the past as a reason to limit activists' right to mobilize. In this case, this law may be considered as a form of institutional repression. Let's imagine further that you're able to obtain a permit to march. If for whatever reason the local police decide that your event might be disruptive, then they might show up. They may show up to initially monitor your march, but depending on how the event unfolds, police may confront protesters. If this confrontation limits activists' ability to protest, then this would be an example of situational repression. I'm sure you've all seen protesters being arrested or engaging in violent conflict with the police. Of course, the two forms of repression, institutional and situational, support each other, as the police usually have legal reasons for the repression of public protests. The second issue I'd like for us to think about is the question of who is engaging in repression. It's easy to think about enforcement agencies such as the police as the ones who may repress protests, but it's also important to think about multiple repressive groups, including non-state actors. For example, in September of 2019, roughly 400 supporters of LGBT+ rights marched through the Polish city of Lublin, a democratic society, mind you. At that march, however, a group of, quote, counter-protesters gathered to challenge them. These counter-protesters not only yelled at the marchers, but also engaged in violent acts against them. In this case, the repression came from fellow citizen groups. Overall, then, when anticipating the kinds of repression in a democratic society, I encourage you to think about the different types of repression you may face, either institutional or situational, as well as the different actors who may engage in that repression. Thank you.